The Institute is very interested in what we call the future of the human. And we, humans, are creating potentially a new human. We're doing it using lots of different technology, from AI to gene editing to quantum computing. So in essence, we're sort of playing God. And the question is, who are we creating? Who do we want to create? And one of the things that you've seen in science fiction, and that is in our imagination, is the machines that we're creating, how alike or not are they to us? How human are they? Do they have emotions? Do they have feelings? How will they relate to us? Who will they be? And that question is a question that we've been thinking about. And tonight, Tobias Rees from the Institute runs our Transformation of the Human program, and he's going to be speaking with Antonio Damasio and Hartmut Neven. Antonio is a friend, and he so happens to be at USC running the Brain Institute. He's a neuroscientist and a philosopher. And we very much appreciate this combination, because having science is one thing, or technology, having a philosophy for the technology is equally important. And he's sort of at the intersection of those two. Hartmut Neven, luckily, has become a friend thanks to one of our board members who's here tonight, Eric Schmidt. So I met Hartmut last summer, and he runs quantum computing at Google, and so happens to have achieved some very important breakthroughs. So the conversation between Hartmut and Antonio is going to be quite interesting. And in truth, it's more than a conversation. They're working on a project together. And the project, which they can talk to you about, in theory, is how do you make a sentient robot? Is that even possible? So I think that's the conversation we're going to have tonight. And I'm grateful in advance. So thank you for being here. And thank you especially to Hartmut, Antonio, Tobias, and Eric.
Well, I made a few notes to orient our conversation. We're going to start with notes from me and notes from Hartmut, and then we're going to have a conversation open. All of you, if you're interested, that will be moderated for the suites. First, let me give you, I think Nicholas already, well, thank you very much for hosting us, but he already gave us a very good idea of why we're here. And the closest motive for this particular meeting and this conversation, and in fact for the collaboration that we now have with Hartmut, is a recent paper that was published at the end of 2019 in Nature, Machine Intelligence. And that's a paper that was authored by me and by a former graduate student of mine who is now a prized collaborator and is here. His name is Kingston Mann. And in this paper, if I tell you the title, actually, it will put you in the spirit of what we're going to discuss. The title, if I remember, was Homeostasis, Soft Robotics, and Feeling Machines. So we put on purpose these three sort of blunt propositions to get people in the spirit of something that normally is not in the mind of people who are discussing, for example, artificial intelligence or robotics. So the first thing is homeostasis, and I need to say a few words about it because many of you may not know the word, and it's perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable, but you know that you have it. And if it weren't for homeostasis, none of us would be here. And homeostasis, very simply, is the set of rules that are part of any living organism, but by the way, not part at all of any machine that we humans design. And it's the set of rules according to which, if you follow them, if you follow the dictates of homeostasis, you're going to have a chance of survival. If you don't follow the dictates of homeostasis, you're going to go downhill, you're going to get sick, you're going to die. And so it's very interesting because biology has a very interesting history, sort of meanders. Um, when you look at the past 30 or 40 years of biology, there's been a tremendous amount of interest, first of all, in finding out about microsystems and microscopic systems, but it's been dominated by an interest in evolution, which is perfectly fine because we now know that we have a particular kind of evolution, we have a particular kind of process that through selection allows certain organisms to survive and others not to. But very little attention has been given to the conditions of life that are subject to evolutionary pressures and selection and so forth. And this has been changing now very rapidly to the point that in recent years, and in fact right now, the most exciting papers that are coming up have to do with the conditions under which an organism, be it one single cell, for example, a bacterium, or a creature like us, multicellular, how that creature can survive. And these conditions are incredibly complex, but very interestingly, they're of the same kind, never mind if you are with the bacterium or with one of us. So the conditions are fundamentally the same. Whether you have one cell or a trillion, you have to keep those cells operating within a certain range. And if that range is actually beyond optimal or beyond the necessary, you will actually have a very, very flourishing machine. And if not, you have a sick machine that is going to die. Okay, so this is the first thing that I wanted to remind you of. There is a fundamental difference between living machines, which obey homeostasis, and machines such as we have in robotics typically, which rather than having the vulnerability of homeostasis, the weaknesses of homeostasis, have rather the strengths that we put in them because we design them to be strong and to work very well and to not be at the mercy of simple weaknesses. So they are exactly the contrary of what we are. And they're also different in one other thing, is that whereas creatures like us have an automatic way of inspecting the condition of our life, which is done through feeling, robotics typically do not have that possibility. In fact, not just typically, they don't have that possibility. So what they have is, instead of having weakness, vulnerability, and this need to manage life within a range that is compatible with the continuation of that life, with survival, what they have is robustness, and they have a concentration on the kind of cognitive aspect that allows you to have a very quick and rapid and efficient computation, but they have nothing whatsoever that resembles feelings. Whereas we have feelings, and we have feelings because they are giving us, in a mental manner, an expression of how good or how bad the homeostasis is being run within us at any given moment. So when you feel what we can call in our language well-being, that simply means that your homeostatic process is within one of the ranges of compatible equilibrium. There's not one level of equilibrium, there are many. It can be in an optimal state, in which case you feel joyful and happy and flourishing, or it can be in a state that is not so good and it goes towards malaise, feeling sick, or even worse, feeling pain and eventually dying. So think about this marvelous thing. We living organisms are different on many counts, but one of the main counts is the fact that we have a way of expressing mentally the state of our living condition. And normally people don't think about this with feelings. The feelings are used in a less functional, less operational way, and people think about feelings in terms of romance, for example. But feelings are the sentinels, the informers of the state of our life. And by the way, they end up being the undergirding for what then becomes emotions and emotional feelings. But we leave that aside for a minute. The next thing I wanted to call attention to is the fact that when we thought about feeling machines and about homeostasis, we were thinking about this reality. If you take a robot, a typical robot, and a very good robot that will do lots of interesting things for which it has been designed. That machine is extremely robust, but at the same time, it's extremely narrow in the compass of what we can do. So if that machine was designed for to play, say, game X, if you ask that machine to play game Y, the machine is not going to be able to do it because it's been designed around that particular goal, that particular desire. And why? Well, it's been designed by great engineers to produce this function, and that does it brilliantly and robustly. And unless you take an axe to it, it's going to keep doing it for quite a time. We, on the contrary, are very vulnerable, very weak. But guess what? When you look at our history, the history of creatures that are living like us, and right now we can look at the history of about 4 billion years. You look at the history of weakness, vulnerability, lots of creatures that die, lots of creatures that get sick, and then lots of creatures that triumph in evolution and get to be, guess what, very smart. So what we are today is the result of the repeated use of our weakness, of our vulnerability, which comes through the fact that we are homeostats. And the fact that that weakness was turned into strength by allowing us, with our intellect, allowing us to generate better solutions for the problems that are before us. And that's why living creatures like us are extremely smart and have literally conquered the world and will conquer the universe, because we have this possibility of finding solutions, which comes through the tremendous intellectual capacity that has been built on the backs of our weakness. So that gives you the sort of basic intellectual background for what we thought. And what we thought is this: well, why not use this setup, the basic, weak, vulnerable setup of humans, and try to transfer it to machines? And this is an idea that, for example, Kingston and I have been talking about for several years. But recently, it has become more viable because of the development of soft robotics. And soft robotics, in a quick word, instead of having things that are really, like steel and silicon hard and not deformable, we have now a number of materials that are deformable, materials that are flexible, and inside of which you can put detectors, ways of signaling what happened to the material. A little bit like what we have in our own bodies, because keep in mind that what the source of our feelings is actually the information that is coming through our nervous system, a very particular kind of nervous system, which is the interoceptive nervous system, and is coming from every nook and cranny of our bodies towards the central nervous system, and is giving information about the deformations that, for example, our connective tissue or our smooth muscle or other parts of our body are undergoing as a result of illness of some kind, as a result of, for example, of a cut, a wound, a disease, for example, the virus that is now pandemic in our universe. So all of the possibility that we have these deformations that can signal a state that is away from the state, one of the states of equilibrium, is a novelty. So our idea, in a nutshell, was to first of all use this as a research platform, because that's one of the great interests. This happens to be an ideal research platform to study things like feeling, to study consciousness, to study a variety of other biological processes that are very interesting to us humans, and they have applications both in terms of understanding what a human being is, but also in terms of understanding illness, in terms of understanding disease, which is obviously badly needed, as you know. So the idea here was to have a big research platform, but in addition, we have this hope that something like these creatures can actually be constructed, at least first of all simulated and then eventually constructed, because there's the soft robotics, because there's this notion of homeostasis, and we would be able to with the great computational power that we have today, we would be able to use to model some of the things that we now know we have in our brains to resolve problems, and have that as part of these machines, which would have the ability to be to have in fact something equivalent to pain and suffering, and therefore behave differently in relation to us and in relation to others. Also, just one more thing to make it a bit more enticing. Think about a machine that could, contrary to what happens with today's robotics, a machine that could detect the fact that something was amiss in its own body, and that therefore it had to behave differently in relation to others because of what was going wrong in its body, which probably would be created by what was going wrong in its own environment. And then think about yet another possibility. If you can build machines that have a possibility of quote unquote feeling, obviously it's not like our feelings exactly, but it's a simulacrum that could work. Think about the possibility of that machine being empathetic with others, being empathetic in relation to us and being empathetic in relation to other machines. This is a critical issue, because what has allowed living organisms and eventually human living organisms to behave morally and to have a sense of ethics is in fact the feeling system. If it weren't for the fact that we have pain and suffering, we would never have developed anything like a moral system. Our ethics are dependent on the possibility of feeling, not on the possibility of brilliant cognition. Moral systems did not come out of chess playing. They came out of suffering and coping with suffering and inventing solutions to reduce suffering in the self or in others. Okay, so if you have the possibility of having creatures that would be able to not only suffer, but feel the suffering of others and empathize with others, we could actually create something very interesting. And it should not escape our attention the fact that right now there are a number of people that are justifiably concerned with the future of artificial intelligence and robotics. And many people have scenarios that are quite, they're debatable, where eventually these creatures that we have created turn against ourselves and create a lot of havoc. That's, of course, very debatable. There are several reasons why things may not be as bad as people want to make it, but there are causes for concern. If we have, though, a generation of creatures that potentially can be feeling and empathetic, we have one possibility of developing a corrective for this. And just like to leave you with one idea, just to entice the discussion. Imagine, about the problems of having self-driving cars. You remember this? About self-driving cars. And one of the problems is, how are certain problems of the driving going to be solved? Now, just think for a minute that you had a robot that was running your system, and that robot had, in fact, fear of dying, fear of being destroyed. In the very least, it would put the robot in the same footing as you, because you have that fear. You have that fear when you drive, and that's one of the problems that people face with automation, is that, how is that going to be solved? Is the robot going to be concerned with hitting the pole or killing the person who is on the side of the road? And at least it would put us on the same footing. It put the automation on the same footing as us, which is in a big quandary about how to solve that, which currently is not the case. So this is just a little bit of an enticing story. And now I'm going to give the microphone to Hartmut. Let me just say that it's been a very interesting collaboration. Hartmut has interests that are very focused on quantum computing. We as biologists are interested in certain aspects that could be relevant to understanding our biology. In other words, when you look at your biology, you look at these big things that we have, our bodies, cells galore, then you look at things like the nervous system, and you keep going down to the level of organs, systems, organs, cells within an organ. And then at a certain point, you go inside the cell and you have this living machine. You have molecules that are doing certain jobs, you're doing metabolism. And at a certain point, you say, wait a minute, what's below the molecules? Well, you can say, well, below the molecules, it's physics all the way down, except that part of those physics that are all the way down can actually be at the quantum level, and they're quantum phenomena that can be important for the way we are running our systems. So it may sound a little bit strange that people that are biologists and are interested in these big systems and in these large effects that are created a human mind and feeling, they would be interested in quantum computing and then this level of operations. But it's actually very natural, and quite clearly it's one of the aspects of the future. And that's why it's been so exciting to collaborate with Hartmut.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. So I will try to connect my thoughts to what you just said. So let me start with saying that I've always been fascinated with the question, what constitutes consciousness? What is conscious experience? And I come to this question from the third-person perspective of science. I'm a trained physicist and a theoretical neuroscientist. I've worked in many areas of AI. My PhD was on what today would be called self-driving cars. I've developed face recognition systems. Now I do quantum computing. And sort of building a conscious robot is sort of this elusive thing where you think you will never be able to do it. The second motivation, understanding consciousness, so we all have conscious experience, but conscious experiences are not all alike. And I mean, this is a salon, normally I don't say this, but I feel in this setting, one area that has always fascinated me is psychedelics. And I travel a lot to the Amazon to learn from the last remaining shamans to understand. They have technology to take your conscious experience to outrageous places. And they have technology, they bring you back in. So you come back to tell the tale. So it's a rather safe way of exploring those experiences. And I think most people who had a profound psychedelic experience will probably relate to what did just happen. What was this all about? There's sort of this urge trying to explain how can we make sense of this. And in general, I think this is when you talk about consciousness, any scientific theory of consciousness has to be able to do this. It has to reconcile the third-person perspective of science with our immediate first-person experience of the world. It has to come together. So how would you do this? I think a good starting point is to go consider situations where your first-person perspective and your third-person perspective are correlated. And there, it seems to me that whenever I engage in behaviors that are conducive to my well-being, Antonio's language, conducive to my homeostasis, they tend to feel pleasant, and those that threaten my homeostasis tend to feel unpleasant. If I hold my hand over a candle, that's ouchy. If I have nutritious food, or I have a warm shower, or I take a nap in cuddly blankets, that feels pleasant. So there's a correlation there between the first person and third person perspective. And that's something we should try to explain. How can we explain it? So now I'm fully aware whenever you enter the question of consciousness, you are likely to make a fool of yourself, because this has happened to many deeper thinkers before. So how could we explain this? I would like to try an explanation. Being a scientist, you want to take a materialist, physicalist approach to explaining this. And when you say you take a materialist approach, that essentially says you assume that there is what it's called the physical correlate of consciousness. There's some state of matter or some evolution of state of matter that corresponds to your conscious experience. And that, I should not say this just yet, but maybe here's an angle where you see quantum computers are coming in. Quantum computers, besides being marvelous machines that will compute certain things extraordinarily faster, they are also programmable physics experiments with which we can probe the fabric of reality on a much more fundamental level. So if we say we want to understand what is the physical correlate of consciousness, then with a quantum computer as a tool, you have ability to simulate states of matter in a much more fundamental way. Okay, so within a physicalist approach, how can we try to explain this correlation between feels good and it's conducive to my homeostasis? I could think of two explanation pathways. One would be called psychophysical parallelism. It's actually an old idea from Leibniz, Malebranche, Spinoza. Essentially, it is you have a physics description of a system, and then certain aspects of it you would declare are correlated with the perspective of the system itself. So for example, in physics, we often talk about a system tries to go to a stable state. And we could say, oh, whenever this happens, that feels pleasant. And if the system becomes unstable, that's coinciding with trepidation. So I explained this to Eric once. You could think of, let's say, you see a ball rolling downhill and it takes a certain trajectory. If a physicist would say, why the ball takes this trajectory? A physicist would say, yeah, it took the path of least action. It's just the forces drive it down there. But psychophysical parallelism essentially would say, if you could interview the ball or interrogate its first-person perspective, then the ball might say, oh, hey, I did this, that was fun. So this brings those two perspectives in correspondence, and that, of course, could explain why is it that we feel good. Because if you think about it, if you were tasked engineering hell, then you would just reverse it. Things that are good for you feel terrible. And evolution wouldn't care. To evolve successful organisms, the first-person perspective, in a way, doesn't seem to really matter. So that's explanation one, of psychophysical parallelism. The second route would appeal to free will, because if free will were to exist, and I understand that's a loaded term, but if it were to exist, then presumably the system could use it to assume a more preferable, pleasant state. And then all evolution would have to do is to associate behaviors that are good for the survival of the organism with these pleasant states. And then, again, these two things come together. So these are two explanation pathways for this correlation. So could go two routes now. Let me go in this direction. So armed with some of these thoughts, oh, no, I say this other thing first, because if there's all scientists sitting here, I had once a dinner with John Preskill. He's leading the Quantum Computing Institute at Caltech. So I was telling him the story, and he was like super interested. And at some point he said, hey, wait a minute, Hartmut, I think what you're talking about is really outside of experimental science, because conscious experience is not an observable. And actually, I had admitted that in the very beginning of my talk to him, and when this came up, I was like all disappointed, and the whole weekend after this, I was, man, yes, this is right. But then I thought, this is actually not quite true. There is a loophole. Conscious experience is observable. And go with me through the following Gedanken, with limitations. And let's go through the following Gedanken experiment. Let's say you have two clones of exactly the same system. Yeah, and then the first system is in some state, S. And because it's in state S, it generates some output, O. The second system sees O, say, oh, when I output O, remember they're clones, when I output O, I'm in state S. And I know how state S feels because we are the same thing. So I can know how you just felt. And we employ this protocol all the time. If I see my little boy licking an ice cream and smiling, then it's true that I cannot know the intricacies of how he experiences the ice cream. I have a pretty good idea what's going on. I had ice cream too. But this protocol leads to a fallacy in the sense that if you read texts about consciousness, you often see these, it goes like this. Humans are conscious. I think my dog is conscious. I'm not so sure about my goldfish, and trees and rocks I don't think are conscious. And that is because these systems are more and more dissimilar, so this protocol breaks down. But I think the idea that consciousness is only located in the nervous system of higher mammals will turn out to be as parochial as thinking that the Earth is in the center of the universe. I think that's not correct. So it is part with limitations. The study of consciousness is part of experimental science. So armed with all these ideas, we developed a suggestion, and this is inspired by what Antonio had suggested, because he had this idea of, because in his words, and I heard a talk from Antonio at Stanford, I thought, oh, it's a fellow pilgrim, because he says essentially the same thing. He says, feelings are about checking in how you're doing with your homeostasis. And if you want to make a feeling robot, let's make it with a soft robotic. In soft robotics, a robot that has to worry about its own well-being. So these effects are more pronounced. And when I heard this, I thought, hey, Antonio, in my world, in quantum computing, or in general, the most fragile thing I know of is the state of a qubit. There's a quantum state of quantum bits. This is super fragile. Why don't we build a robot around this, trying to maintain this? And I think without a whiteboard, without formulas, it will be, I think, and assuming that people are not deeply steeped in quantum computing, will be probably a difficult exercise. But essentially, we have developed a very concrete proposal saying this consists of 3 modules. You do this, this, and this, and then arguably you have a conscious robot. Or to use the careful language of Antonio, this is a machine that has the analog of feelings. And so rather than explaining the exact construction, I should maybe just give you an idea, why is quantum mechanics, why would it change the picture? It changes the picture because in classical physics, everything is strictly deterministic. It ultimately does not matter how the robot or how a creature feels. Say, everything would evolve exactly the same way. Whether the participants feel miserable or great along the way, it doesn't matter. It's a deterministic system, nothing changes. So, and I told you one of the 2 explanation pathways how this correlation could come about is free will. But you need some element of non-determinism. And quantum mechanics gives you this. Essentially, when we run a quantum circuit and we measure the output, then, and if you ask the question, why did we just see, let's say, this sequence of zeros and ones, the output of our quantum circuit? The answer is nobody can tell you. There's no answer to this. The best that science has to offer is textbook quantum mechanics that would say, oh no, you saw this because you measured this output because it's a sample of a probability distribution encoded in the quantum state that is the output of your circuit. So essentially I feel this things that this non-determinism that quantum processes can offer you are essential for free will to come in and to break this. That there is a difference between whether it feels good for the participating system or it feels bad for the participating system. And maybe the last thing I should say about this construction, the interesting thing is, Antonio mentioned a research platform. We could build these systems and we could integrate them with a traditional learning system, let's say a deep neural network or a reinforcement learning system. And we can ask the question, a plain vanilla deep neural net learning something and comparing this to the same deep neural net but integrated with a homeostatic engine, which one performs better in strict machine learning terms? Which one needs fewer examples to learn? Which one has a lower generalization error? So we can, in a way, leave philosophy behind and do experiments and see, does this make a difference? And my conjecture would be, it will make a difference. The system that worries about its own well-being, or rather the well-being of its constituent elements, of its or the well-being of its components, that system, for multiple reasons we can think of, will perform better. And I think that can be tested in the lab. And I'm not sure I should go there, but maybe I finish with this. At Google, we have what is called the AI principles, how you responsibly develop AI. And one principle is that you want to have the systems controllable, by humans, accountable. And that's, of course, a reasonable thing to ask. But this line of thought, if it's correct, that a system, a learner that cares about its own well-being performs better, then there's a dilemma. You have a choice. You can either have a more accountable AI or you can have a more performed AI. And there's a trade-off between those two. Okay, we'll stop here.
Well, I think we can just have a brief conversation, then open it up for you so that you can get into the fray. I think you probably see by now one of the reasons why we can have a collaboration, because we have, although on the face of it we're so different in terms of our backgrounds, we have several interests that are shared, and the interest in the fundamentals of feeling is a very important one. And Hartmut touched on something that's quite interesting. Imagine that nature had developed the other way around, and that, for example, the things that were actually good for our functioning had turned out to be things that were felt as pain and suffering, and vice versa in relation to pleasure. It's a very interesting question, because it could have happened that way. And I think there are reasons that we will be able to explore why it is the way it is, and why things that are on the good physiology, so the good functionality, is accompanied by feelings of well-being and feelings of pleasure and so forth. And the things that are going awry are the things that go in the opposite direction, towards suffering and pain and malaise and so forth. But what is so interesting is that we are at the point, for example, we have a pretty good notion of what is it in a living organism that is correlated with bad and good feelings. This, by the way, is part of our research. It's really the past 20 years, because until then people didn't have an idea. But right now we know about parts of the nervous system, parts of the organism, chemistry, all of these different levels, how they are correlated with ways of well-being or pain or suffering and so forth, which is, of course, extremely important, because if you're going to have the possibility of treating people that have problems in this area, we need to know why they have the problem and what the mechanics are of the problem. And many of you are too young to know, but I can tell you that the development, for example, of psychopharmacology, when it came about in the 1950s, I wasn't studying then, but I know about it historically. I can tell you that it was just, touch and go, and it was all, by impressions. Well, maybe this drug will do this, maybe this drug will do that. but we did not have a way of developing anything that could actually help patients with a problem that has to do with feelings in an intelligent way that would be related to the way the thing is put together. And now we have, and we're going to have even more as we learn more. So just to give you an example of some practical value in understanding these systems that we're now beginning to understand at the chemical level, but that could go into the lower, the below the chemical level that we obviously have to have, because this is not, coming out of nothing. So that's something will be practical in terms of these developments. One thing that Hartmut made a very interesting statement, that to think that creatures that, for example, without a nervous system, or creatures that without the complexity we have would not have feelings, or would not have consciousness, will turn out not to be true. And I think that to a great extent, I entirely agree. And what is interesting is that there's a correlation here with another thing that people are developing now. Like, for example, this week we had in our lab, we had the visit of another major thinker in this area, a man from Harvard and Tufts called Michael Levin. And we were talking about for a long time in the career of neuroscientists and for the general public, the brain was everything. And we're still in that phase. You open the New York Times in the Science Times page and you will have things about the brain only. And people, for example, ask, how are we going to understand consciousness? Guess what? It's the brain. You will ask a philosopher about consciousness and they will talk about the hard problem. Guess what? The hard problem is this problem, which, by the way, does not exist, but some people think it does. And the idea is that how can the brain generate something like a feeling? It's just impossible to understand. You know why it's impossible to understand? Because it's not generated by the brain alone. We are not organisms made of brains alone. On the contrary, we're organisms made mostly of a body, a living body. And just to point out to you the gravity of this mistake, let me tell you this story. Life begins on Earth about 4 billion years ago, okay? It begins with bacterium. And it stays, for 1 billion years, you have nothing else but creatures like that. Nervous systems began on Earth 500 million years ago. See the difference? So for most of the time of life on Earth, there have been living things, and those living things have been very complex, have done incredible feats of deciding to mate, not mate, sociality. Bacteria have sociality. They create groups. They can fight among each other. They can decide who is a friend and who is a foe. All of that is done without any brain whatsoever. There's no neuron, there's no nervous system. When we finally developed nervous systems 500 million years ago, which is a pittance, this is Cambrian explosion stuff, okay? You develop that, and then very gradually we ascend to the kinds of brains we have today. And those brains are nothing but a speciation, a complication of pathways of chemistry and pathways of bioelectricity that existed in cells. So fundamentally, we are still being run by bioelectrical phenomena. And it doesn't make any difference if they are in one single cell called the bacterium doing its job alone with a membrane around, or if it's doing it in an organism with 20 million or 20 billion cells, as is our case. So the thing that I ask you all to think is, when people tell you that something cannot be understood in terms of the brain, say, okay, fine, so be it. It doesn't have to. It has to be understood in terms of the general functioning of an organism that has both brain, nervous system, and non-brain, non-neural processes. And that's what is giving us the life, in fact. And when you feel what you feel, when you say, I'm really tired, what is tired? Your nervous system? No. What is tired is your muscles is the kind of metabolism that you're having. And when you feel sleepy, it's the state of your body. And of course, that's reflected in the nervous system, which is a great advantage. But it's not the state of the nervous system that counts, it's the body. All of that, just to say one more comment, then I shut up. The idea that this gave an enormous opportunity to human evolution, which is this. We had for this long time brains and bodies working together, and that was fine. But then at a certain point, things got to a stability that permitted the nervous system to actually ascend to a new level. What's that new level? Is the level that everybody's using in this room, which is the level of images. Now, thanks to one part of the nervous system in particular, which is the cerebral cortex, and some brainstem nuclei, like for example, the colliculi and the geniculate, we are able to make maps, things that, for example, bacteria can't make. So bacteria can be very smart and do incredible feats of intelligence and decision-making, and in fact, cognition, but they cannot have this ability to map out this room the way I have right now. And you're mapping out the two of us sitting here, and you're mapping the sounds of our voices. All of that is maps that are done with spatiality and with metrics to them. And this is the base of our visual images, of our sound images, of the images of the things we touch, and so forth. And it is on their basis that we do reasoning, and that we do the communication that we have, and that we can develop languages and so on. So just to have really a beautiful story here, don't let people convince you that it's all about the brain. It's not. It's about the body in huge amount. But then don't let people say, well, it's just the body and it doesn't make any difference if we have a brain or not, because that's stupid. Obviously, it makes a lot of difference to have a brain that can be intelligent, but that is something that is actually developed in very big creatures like us, and has developed extraordinarily, of course, in humans, thanks to a variety of things that we're not going to touch on. But so you can see how this connects.
Thank you so much,
Tobias.
Antonio and Hartmut. I just want to put something in perspective, or emphasize something, and then ask a question to the two of you. What I want to emphasize is that it gets very easily lost that we talk about a massive event, a real mini revolution, or actually a full revolution here. Why? Because we see an effort of building machines in biological terms. And one has to remember that throughout the 19th and the 20th century, machines were the non-biological, they were the artificial, right? So the concept or the notion of the machine that we have, we inherited from the Industrial Revolution. These are big, cold, mechanical things. Don't behave like a machine. And you're so cold and mechanical in your relations to me. So the machine is actually the exact opposite of a biological organism for a long time. And now we want to build intelligent machines. And Antonio comes along and says, well, in living systems, weakness is correlated, positively correlated with intelligence. Unless you're weak, unless you suffer, unless you can die, you don't have intelligence. And the reason why you have all of these things is that you have a body. But we build currently AI without a body. So how can AI ever be intelligent? So there is an invitation to learn to think about machines almost in embryological or evolutionary terms as biological things without confusing the living and the non-living to some degree. That's where physics becomes really powerful, or quantum physics, because the distinction between natural things and artificial things that we all take for granted every minute of the day seems to not matter from the perspective of what they're doing. That's a huge, imagine you go to engineering school and it's an invitation to think about machines in biological terms. That's actually pretty powerful, I think. But I want to come to a question that is very interesting to me, and that is, I wonder if you could elaborate a little more about the relation of homeostasis. So the possibility of losing one's homeostasis, of being aware of this and relating to it, and consciousness, that's step one. And then the relation between homeostasis, consciousness, and morals. So the reason why I'm asking this is it's easy to imagine that there is a robot that can die. And the robot suddenly gets worried because it can die. So if you worry, there must be some form of awareness of your actual condition. And so you can make a link to consciousness to some degree. However, one of the discussions that I remember we had, Nicholas actually triggered the question is, what if the robots could die, but they could not survive on their own? So that they would actually need to recognize that another robot is about to die, and I need to help that robot. And somehow this alone, one robot recognizing the mental state or the physical state of another robot, is actually something that is incredibly powerful. You must have some form of awareness or empathy, and that links to morals. So I wonder how you connect homeostasis, consciousness, and morals through these experiments.
So let me try that. Very interesting question, Tobias. So the first thing I would like is to make a direct connection between feelings and consciousness. This is very, very critical. Sometimes people hear the word feeling or think about feelings, and they don't relate it at all to the process of consciousness. And if I tell you a couple of things about this, you will see the intimate relation. First of all, we have to make a distinction, a principal distinction, between homeostatic feelings and feelings of emotion. So what are homeostatic feelings? Hunger, thirst, desire, pain. These are very good examples. What are these things? They're signals that are being sent to you, given to you in your consciousness. You need to be conscious. If it wouldn't be conscious, it wouldn't work. And they're telling you, you need food, you need drink, or you're feeling sick, you need to watch out, or you're feeling hot, or you're feeling cold, or you have sexual desire. All of these things are part of the running of your physiology, of your functionality, and they're being given to you directly and for no cost, okay? Now, there's another kind of feeling which is built on this, which is emotional feeling, and that came much later. Bacteria don't have emotional feelings that we know of. But if you have, for example, if things are, if you want to do something and people cross you and say, no, you cannot do that, and you get angry, what you do is that you have a reaction that is very patterned, has been inherited in evolution, has existed for a long time, and gives you a pattern that everybody recognizes as anger. And that, in turn, changes the way your internal milieu is operating and gives you a feeling of that emotion. Or somebody tells you a joke and you laugh very happily, and it does exactly the same thing. There's a pattern of emotion which is in your face, in your body, and changes your organism completely for a few seconds, and that change is felt by you, okay? Now, think about the thing that I said en passant and not emphasizing too much. If you were not conscious, you would not know that you have these things called feelings. So the notion of feeling and the notion of consciousness are inseparable. And I will go a little bit more and tell you what I'm writing about right now, which is to say that, in fact, feelings were historically the beginning of consciousness. There was no consciousness until you had feelings. And it's out of necessity. It's out, the biological necessity was to have feelings so that we could run our organisms better. And we could not run our organisms better if we were not conscious of the information that was coming in the form of feeling. So the two things are tied at the hip. And these two things, from a point of view of the brain, quite interestingly, are also tied to the fact that the nervous system is dipped into our body, and the nervous system ends up being able to have this collusion of feeling and consciousness because it's coming out of our entrails. It's literally distributed in our body, and it's giving us this information, which is vital for the running of our lives and has been vital for the running of many other creatures' lives, even if they were not smart like us. So, for example, there's no reason to think that a fish, when the fish evades pain, which it does, or when a little bird evades pain or manifests immense joy at finding the grains that it's eating, that creature is not feeling that particular state. And if it does, it's beginning to have consciousness. Of course, their brains are not accompanied by the powers of our brains. They may have a much simpler imagetic representation, and they don't have the reservoirs of cognition that we have, which were the ones that very smartly, the people that developed artificial intelligence first harnessed into computers. I think it was actually a very, very smart strategy.
I wonder how a panpsychist who thinks that possibly conscious is inert in matter thinks about what Antonio was just saying.
He's not a panpsychist.
No, but I give him the role to play one.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this prompt. Actually, I do think of myself as a panpsychist. So panpsychism is essentially the idea that you should locate the propensity for conscious experience with the elementals of physics. And think of it more like charge or mass. And actually, the best place, I think, to locate consciousness, and I would have to unpack it for you, but just as a take-home sentence, and then I would like to call this, because it's influenced by the ideas, I would like to call this a generalized Penrose-Hameroff conjecture. And essentially, it would say the following. Consciousness is how a system experiences the emergence of a unique classical world. And you might wonder why a unique classical world. This is actually one of the key lessons from quantum mechanics, that see in everyday reasoning or in classical physics, we look at a system like this table in the following way. There's a certain configuration like these glasses. And if we were to know the glasses, oh, sorry, not the glasses. So there's these glasses. And if we were to know the forces that act on this, then we can make a prediction how this table will look in the next 5 minutes. Yeah, that's what physicists do. They look at a state of a system at some point in time, calculate the forces, and see how it changes. That's also how we operate typically in day-to-day reasoning. But quantum mechanics would tell you, wait a minute, that's not enough, because imperceptible to us, we see only one configuration, the glass is standing like this, but we could make another configuration like this. In coronavirus times, I shouldn't do that too much. So I bring it back. But you see that I can make many configurations, actually a huge number of them. And quantum mechanics, the basic lesson is that all these different configurations do exist. They have ontological status. And if you wanted to make a really precise prediction what's going to happen, you have to take all these configurations into account. And I'm sure you have heard these terms. So this is sort of the many worlds idea that quantum mechanics suggests. So it's the same story I told for the glasses. It's also true for us. We are just one configuration. We could, Antonio and I, we could switch places. And there comes a question, why do we experience this classical world or this configuration over all the others? And I think this is what consciousness is. It's sort of how it feels to select one configuration out of the myriad of configurations that quantum mechanics tells us are there.
I can agree with that if I make a small change or a small preface. You're talking about the undergirding of phenomena that can appear in consciousness and in feeling. In other words, I don't have any dispute over what you just said, except that that is below. It's below the level at which we can make, at the moment, informed scientific observations in terms, for example, of biology or the nervous system. So it's fine. And if you call it an undergirding, if you call it the basement of the process, I don't have any problem. On the contrary, I like it very much, because that's actually what I want, is to find things that, physics all the way down. What's underneath physically in relation to neurons, in relation to non-neural cells, in relation to bodies, and so forth. So I think that we have a fundamental agreement, provided we recognize that there's a difference in levels and there's a difference in the language that we use to describe those levels. But it's an advantage to have that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's say when you have an atom and it has its electrons on its orbitals, and there comes another atom and bumps into it, and then one of the electrons gets excited. I would say it comes along with sort of a proto-conscious moment, but it has only very few bits. So this has to be orchestrated into full-fledged feelings, and there an organism comes in handy. I would agree with you.
Maybe that's a good moment to open it up to questions while we get the microphones from here to there. I want to just use this as I'm not giving out the microphone, as an opportunity to say, this is a beautiful window onto the work, one aspect of the work that the Berggruen Institute does. When you go to university today, you have a faculty of arts that asks philosophical questions and never gets really in touch with neuroscience, let alone with quantum computing. You have a faculty of science and engineering that is about quantum computing or neuroscience, and the two of them don't necessarily talk. But we live in a world where this division of labor is almost funny, not to say ridiculous. So we need philosophers and artists. We need neuroscientists and quantum computing engineers to talk to each other, but we also need philosophers and artists in these labs to rethink what our understanding of the world is. And one easy example is if electrons are a kind of Ursoup, a kind of have a kind of proto-consciousness, and if machines can have a form of consciousness, then what consciousness is and was for us humans is dramatically changing, because for a couple of hundred years, we were the only conscious thing in the world, and that's how we organized the world into human and non-human things. So there is an extremely powerful new vision of how to think about the world, about how to think about what it means to be human in the world, about the status of a machine and how we should build machines in this world, emerging from these kinds of conversations. And this kind of new mode of thinking, this new vocabulary that is needed to produce this, is precisely the work that Nicholas has had the vision to make possible. So please.
Two questions. So the first one is, given we're living in a very fraught emotional time where there's a lot of anger and rage, etc., I'm curious from both of your perspectives, what might be in present day, the evolutionary advantages or function of emotions like rage or hate and the second one is in AI, given that there's a level of consciousness, what are feelings or emotions that AI consciousness could experience that humans can't? Julia Pierpont.
So in relation to your question about the function of something like rage, which is obviously a very present emotion in today's societies, and not just our society, but it's really across the world, probably for very good reasons that have to do with ways of synchronizing those reactions, largely through social media. If you ask me the function of it, most of it, no function whatsoever that is good or desirable. I think it is, but that's not 100% true. So obviously rage, anger, most of the time is a destructive emotion. And most of the time, if it's done in small amounts, it's very good because it's defensive. You know, the reason why anger has triumphed in evolution and why animals before us and we still have anger in our repertoire is that, of course, there are many situations in which we need to defend ourselves, and the integrity of our life depends on, kicking hard and getting rid of the enemy. But of course, if this is used for everyday conversation and discussion of anything from the trouble with healthcare or politics in general, then of course it's not very constructive. But even so, we don't know, because it could, after periods of that big accumulation of rage, although I'm not quite sure that there's anything quite like what we're having at the moment, there could be a change, there could be a transformation, which could be for the good. So, we have to we have to wait and see. But fundamentally, it doesn't look to me like it is a very constructive way of behaving. And classically, there are a good number of emotions that they have to do, for example, with compassion, with benevolence towards others. They are far more constructive, and that normally you end up falling upon, even after bad times. When you look historically, for as long as we have history, we've had, of course, periods of great upset, and there were both intellectual and emotional developments that made people transcend those periods and end up in a better place. So that's
Okay, so but anger can be defensive, but how does hatred function in a?
Are there any states that AI cannot have that humans have? In fact, I could imagine AI could have many more states than humans.
I wanted to pick up on one aspect of your question. Like, what could the function be of feelings within AI? Because the danger when you make some proposals or even talk about consciousness, at Google we have a lot of very practical colleagues, like Hartmut. You're wasting your time. You have to impress them with something useful. What would a homeostatic engine capable of feelings do within an AI system? And actually, Kingston and I, we did some brainstorming the other day, and we came actually up with a list of, it's actually a whole page of reasons why we believe that a learner integrated with a homeostatic engine will outperform a learner without one. And it goes to very tactical things, and I, of course, cannot go through the list, but I just give you one concept that is actually, we learned this from another professor at USC, Erwin Biedermann. He has a fascinating paper that shows that along the visual pathway, there's an increasing density gradient of opioid receptors. And what he thinks these opioid receptors do, they turn us into infowars. We are novelty seekers. But of course, on a strict information theoretical basis, then you would like white noise on your TV. Like if you just get these noise patterns, they're completely novel and you should be excited. But this pathway works such that we enjoy novelty, that is to a good degree interpretable in terms of what we learned already. So that's what this pathway does. So we are sort of smart infowars. And that, for example, could be guided smart novelty seeking would be one of the functions that a homeostatic engine integrated into a learner would help you do.
Right. It's a very important point here is that, there are these sort of big effects like feeling a state of pleasure or like feeling, an appetite for something. But at lower levels within the network, within a neural net in our brains, we also have a release of certain molecules, like, for example, opioids. And that may not be an immediate big high, like if you would take, an opioid immediately, or I had a glass of wine. It's a more subtle effect, but it's there contributing to the way you learn. Because one thing we do know is that you learn better when you are in happy states, quote unquote. So if the feeling is positive, you have a higher chance of retaining what you are learning, what you're being exposed to. But it's so interesting that even that is not 100% true, in the sense that if you are in ecstatic joy and you are overjoyed, you actually will not learn. Your learning will decline. So you need to have a certain amount of positive affect. But if you have too much, you damage it, and if you have too little, you don't learn. So you have to grade it.
And that second question about can an AI feel?
I think
what
everyone
humans-
ask one question is better because there are so many people who want to ask questions.
Real quick. So as you were speaking, I was imagining at USC there's a lab and there's a whole bunch of happy robots that have little hands that can feel, with their warm and so forth and so on. But then I thought it's far more efficient to build a software system where the robots are in fact simulated. Now, in fact, wouldn't you be able to prove your thesis with a series of independent robots that were AI systems, that were fast learners in some kind of gameplay to prove whether this is true or not, rather than actually attempting to build robots with actual physical motors and sensors and so forth.
So how would you build it? Tell me again. I'm trying to picture it.
So all hardware systems today have digital twins.
Yeah.
So if you built a robot, you would build a digital simulator.
Yeah.
So I'm suggesting that you just build the simulator, right? Because the simulator can evolve much faster than the hardware.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting idea. Yeah.
I would have a good answer why this wouldn't work. I think we discussed it last summer. So remember the story is the other day I went with my little boy to teach him to ride a bike. So we go out on the street, and so the first day sort of he wobbles along, it doesn't go too well. So me being a bad dad saying, "Hey, Lucas, you're a little clumsy, really, Dad?" Starts to cry, okay, next day we try again. And he gets a hang of it and zooms down the street with his little bike. And he's like overjoyed, every little fiber of his being like beaming with, "I got this." And I was reminded, like I said in the beginning, I built many AI systems in my career. And I thought, let's say our face detectors, it's unlikely that, so there obviously for my little boys, there's a congruence between learning success and a pleasant emotion. And I do not think that the AI systems I've built so far show this congruence. And I think one can make a very plausible argument why this is, and this is just a symmetry argument. Essentially, between, let's say, a face detector getting it right or wrong, it is essentially a bit being set somewhere or not set. So it's often maybe just a translational symmetry between getting it right or wrong, and that while it's not logically impossible, it seems implausible that states of matter that are so similar and just related by a simple symmetry transformation would show this difference in feeling good or bad. You need to have more interesting differences in the material substrate with which you use to implement these things. And that's again where a quantum computer comes in. As you well know, a quantum computer is just excellent in modeling material states as we please.
To respond to the question, well, to respond to the question of why not just do it in simulation rather than deal with all the pain of a real physical robot, there's a phrase that with a real robot, you have the privilege of dealing with reality. There's, with softness, especially soft materials, they have almost infinite levels or degrees of freedom of movement that are impossible, computationally intractable to simulate in silico. So that's just one answer, but of course we need to start with simple simulations and then move to realized robots. That is where we will eventually get to.
Before we go to the next question, Eric, we're working through the Institute with a small startup that builds robots that can write their own simulation so that they don't have to live in the simulated world that human designers built, but the robot really has an experience that is new and must simulate it, sort of build a model of the world in order to then move on, which is a pretty powerful moment because now robots are world-making things. Of course, this world-making must be correlated with homeostasis because that's the only reason why we need it.
I'm really happy to talk about bits and softness and empathy. So the question I wanted to ask each of you is, since we've been able to measure things like the number of bits per second your eyes take in your ears, we know they're in the millions, tens of millions. If we're to design a machine that's like us, what's the computational range in which a human functions in order to have a good enough map of itself to map onto another person? We're talking hundreds of millions, billions of bits per second. Or is that an answerable question? I'm trying to think of, if you wanted to quantify it to build a machine, good to know what the capacity.
Some thought. And this comes from introspection, and there's a rule of thumb in neurobiology that introspection is a very poor guide. But when it comes to consciousness, I don't have that many choices. But it seems to me that conscious experience is often contains rather few bits. It's sort of the executive summary of the situation, where we have about 1 million fibers per eye going to the primary visual cortex. This is the full information. What we are consciously aware of is much, much less. It's probably tens of bits, maybe not more.
Yes. There's also the power of this work to have non-human forms of consciousness, right? To actually build things that, we already have lots of humans, and of course it's a nice effort through neuroscience in particular to find out how we humans are conscious, but to actually invent new beings that could exist but don't currently exist is one of the power of these projects.
It's a different question you're answering than I'm not what is the present awareness. Marvin Minsky and Alan Kay and all these guys would agree with what you just said. That in the moment it's 10, 11, 12 perspective. But what is the totality of computational time? Point of think about replicating a human with empathy. What's the totality of computation?
Because you're asking the wrong guy, I would say. You have quantum processes, and they are exceedingly expensive to simulate. There's no computer on this planet, classical computer, short of a quantum computer, that would be able to do it.
Sure. My question is, as AI gets better at mimicking emotional intelligence or feelings, are you worried about how people will interact with these systems? Because they will think that they understand them, that they feel the feeling they feel, and you're trying to get that path. But are you worried that we're mimicking this, but it's not real? It's not real emotions or feeling, and because of that, it's an imbalance, and humans might assume that this is a true understanding or feeling, and that might have societal or emotional impacts on people.
Well, actually, no, I'm not worried about that. It's a very interesting question. Humans are extremely gullible. And humans are very happy to interact with, the Japanese little toys,
Tamagotchi.
Yeah, so we're constantly having empathy towards this. Provided you have a little bit of a smile, you empathize. No, I actually think the opposite. I think that there would be enormous advantages. Think, for example, of, we're an aging society. Think of creatures that could actually be helpful to elderly people, and that would have a positive interaction and being capable of helping, but being sensed as more realistic and closer to the human. So I'm not terribly worried about that. Yeah, so I think
we take 2 more questions, but I suggest we combine them. Okay, we take 3 more questions and we combine them. One in the back, please get started. Then I give the microphone briefly to Bing Song and one for Mark.
Okay, so thank you for the fascinating talk. So on the subject of understanding consciousness, so we all know that when we're in a situation, we don't see things as clearly as an observer, or there's that joke where an old fish swims by 2 young fish and says to the fish, "How's the water?" And the young fish is like, "What's he talking about?" So in terms of understanding consciousness, has there been an experiment or device that's been invented where it would observe or understand consciousness rather than us being conscious beings trying to understand consciousness?
say again.
So right now we're trying to understand and explain consciousness with our own consciousness and mind.
Yeah.
Has there been an experiment or device that's been created to try and understand consciousness from an observer's perspective?
Well, theoretically, yes. No, there's no gadget. In other words, there's no experimental setting like the one you are describing. But there are many ways of approaching this scientifically that range from simulations of certain structures, which is one way, exploring the structures that we know exist in our biology, both in terms of the brain and pathways outside of the brain, and even studying with a new perspective the cases that are created by disease. there's a fairly large range of conditions, neurological conditions, where as a result of damage to the brain in one particular sector or another, you have disturbances of consciousness. Those have been studied generally with a very narrow point of view, and sometimes with a very wrong point of view, which is perfectly fine, historically corresponding to the knowledge and the concepts of the times. And now we have a new opportunity, armed with new knowledge and with new models, to interact with that, with those data. So, for example, damage to particular nuclei of the brain stem, damage to parts of the spinal cord, damage to parts of the cerebral cortex. All of those give us a tremendous amount of knowledge. And a lot of this knowledge is being developed as we speak. For example, until quite recently, it was not known that the system that captures feeling, that allows us, for example, to feel pain or to feel pleasure, is a system, while we use interoceptive pathways with the nerve conduction into the spinal cord or to the brainstem, it actually uses ways that are completely different from the ones that we use when we are seeing. So the pathways that bring light into our retinas and from there to our visual cortex have an engineering that is completely different from the engineering that brings, that allows me, for example, to kick my knee and feel pain. And what is so interesting is that those that are related to the body have, again, a commingling of body and nervous system, which is absolutely fascinating. So you have axons in neurons that don't have myelin and therefore are not insulated and leak current and can be literally attacked by a molecule at any point in the pathway. Or you have cell bodies that are exposed to the bloodstream because there's no blood-brain barrier, unlike we have in our cerebral cortex. So there are all sorts of amazingly detailed bits of knowledge about how this thing works. And this is knowledge that we didn't have 5 years ago and that we need to apply. And again, we can apply either on a platform like we are describing or in other kinds of studies. But the point is that we will know more about consciousness to go with your suggestion.
I guess my question is also related to consciousness. You sort of answered in part already. My question relates to how consciousness can be developed or emerge from the soft robot, because all the work that you have been depicting at this point, it seems to be still in the world of physical and the materialistic world. That's just essentially, how the consciousness, I don't know what kind of definition you take. I tend to think the consciousness goes beyond the physical world. So how can you just merely based on the physical and the materialistic kind of, technical, the materialistic based materials, how can consciousness emerge or develop out of that?
Right. Well, you ask a very important question that this would take the next month to answer. But we're working on an assumption in which we do have sets of physical structures that are producing a set of phenomena that are actually within the compass of those physical structures. In other words, we have, it's an equivocal position to answer your question directly. It is both something that on the face of it goes beyond the physical, quote unquote, but at the same time is contained within the broad physical. And again, that's where the world of quantum processes is so important, because it can get at this in-between.
Maybe I felt I said this earlier. I would agree with you that understanding consciousness, you have to go beyond this world in the sense of this configuration, but you don't have to go beyond the many worlds that quantum mechanics tells you there are. I think that is probably enough explanation in non-religious terms.
I have another quantum, but it's kind of a basic, maybe not the best question to end on, but Eric's question made me think of the opposite. That I'm curious from an engineering point how you guys can work together, because if you're biologic and you're quantum, quantum requires super, super cold, a place to be, right, for quantum to work. So how do you do soft robots in real life that can survive? I'm just curious from an engineering point of view, how does that work with the two of you guys?
You do it in the kitchen.
Yes, this goes to the very concrete construction. So the elements of a soft robotic would essentially become quantum states, which are by nature very fragile, and the homeostatic loops become the methods of quantum error correction, which are essentially there to stabilize quantum states. So quantum error correction can be understood in the language of homeostasis. And and I avoided it earlier, but there's a very concrete construction how you would take Antonio's ideas.
Take biological materials that could exist.
It would not be biological materials, but the beauty of a quantum computer is that you can simulate any state of matter faithfully. So a quantum computer could, even though it exists at least for our implementation, in a very cold space, in a special refrigerator, you could nevertheless use it to faithfully replicate processes that are be relevant inside cells as homeostasis is going on.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you, please, Antonio, Hartmut, Tobias. I think it's just, you can see there are more questions than answers here, but this is the most exciting thing for me, because we are right at the edge. Where does the machine start? Where does the human experience stop? How we're going to mix these things, and they're going to get mixed. So we're in your hands, because we'd like to see this feeling, hopefully conscious computer. Be very interesting. So I'm on your side. Please make it happen. I want to thank everyone who's come here tonight for having joined us, including lots of members of the National Academy of Sciences. So thank you.
And thank you to Nicholas for hosting this wonderful event.